Hello YouTube. I have made a number of videos about paranormal phenomena of Central Asia. This is another one about this ancient land and the countries that populate it. I think you will find it interesting, and you can look up my other videos in the playlist Central Asia in this channel. Let me give you some quick explanations before we start. Kurbashi, this is Uzbek word. It means it's the name of that's how they call the senior commander of sufficiently large, capable of active, autonomously armed groups of Basmachi during the struggle against the establishment of Soviet rule in Central Asia. The Basmachi movement, meaning banditry, this was the term that the Soviets used to describe various military, political, national liberation and religious movements in Central Asia in the first half of the 20th century. Iskander, the two-horned one, refers to Alexander the Great. That's how they called him in Asia. The White Tsar refers to the Russian Emperor, one of the Alexanders, also to Nicholas II. And people in leather jackets refers to the KGB operatives, the Chekists as they were called back then. So let's begin, but let me tell you something that many years ago, a Russian writer Bushkov had occasion to speak to former Soviet secret police operatives and wrote down a number of interesting stories, and I've done my research also for many years of Central Asian paranormal phenomena, and some of the things are fascinating in how they correlate to each other. So let's go to the year of 1930, the end of summer. Somewhere at the site Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan and the Chinese province of Kashgar converge in the foothills. So that's how it starts. They did not get lost and did not go astray. They simply had no idea where they were. The Kurbashi Jantai, fleeing from the pursuit, doggedly hanging on the tail, he dodged his fate, not really thinking about anything. He was rushing and running just to break away. The Soviet secret police, combined with reconnaissance group, stubbornly followed almost on his heels, losing his track and then again finding it again. But now they just lost the trail, and it was necessary to guess by scent, instinct, intuition where the old fox might be hiding. Everything was complicated by the fact that the terrain around was completely unfamiliar. Even the guide was depressed. He was gloomily grumbling. The area is forsaken and uninhabited. No one really knows the sites. There are no summer pastures here, which means the shepherds with flocks do not come here. There is no game, so there are no hunters. Empty lands, useless, dry, stony or rocky land with almost no grass, rare juniper trees, indistinguishable gorges, rock debris, cold streams. 11 men with 2 light machine guns, mounted on tired horses. The squadron commander, Comrade Arshak, from the Republic's GPU, meaning Secret Soviet Police. A guide and 8 troops. It wasn't an army, of course, but Jantai had even fewer people, half a dozen, because he was barely beaten in the valley. He was cut down by 3 large machine guns from an ambush. So the survivors broke through the cordon in groups, and special purpose border guard motorized group followed the trail behind him. The Soviet fighters were old-fashioned, not a single newcomer, so to say, and there was no really special reason for gloom. It was not the first time they drove the Basmachi through the mountain wilderness, and it was not the first time they climbed into the wild, unfamiliar places. In addition, they were well aware that Jantai did not know these places just like them. dodging at random, rushing at random, and this gave their chase a good chance. Why should they be discouraged here? In general, they moved on a whim, at random, with all the precautions of experienced hunters of two-legged game, capable of ambushing them at any moment and snapping back with English rifles. They knew approximately. After all, there was a compass in which direction the populated places remained, in which direction the Kashgar border was, where Jantai. Now it is quite clear this is what he was aiming to go to. As far as one can judge, it was still a long way to the border, and however, if necessary, it was possible to violate it just a little, to go a little deeper into the adjacent territory. Not particularly a great power, Kashgar is just one of the provinces into which China actually broke up a long time ago. The Basmachi, they'll take their time and endure of anything. There have been precedents. The Soviet troops saw the city quite unexpectedly, as if sometimes it happens in the mountains, behind a narrow passage between steep rock walls. A valley suddenly opened wide, vast, like you could even arrange cavalry parades there. And there, to the right and below, was a real city. Not some poor village, Kishlak, like they called it. Not a district center. It is a city, at least a couple of versts or miles in length and width. The riders stopped without a command. The machine gunners raised their Lewis guns. There was utter silence. Only the horses sometimes shook their heads noiselessly, and the irons of the bridles rang. It was really close to the city, about half a mile where they were, and without binoculars you can see that there is not the slightest movement near the city, not a single living soul in sight. At first the commander thought that he had miscalculated a little bit, that they were really in Kashgar, but this thought had to be abandoned right there. Firstly, he himself served in these parts for the 4th year, and immediately remembered that there are no such large cities in the adjacent Kashgar districts. Secondly, he finally raised the binoculars to his eyes and examined everything properly. It was a completely different city. It was not like Kashgar, not like Chinese, nor Bukhara or Samarkand. It was surrounded by a wall with towers, as you know, in the pictures from high school history textbook. Only neither the walls nor the towers looked like European fortresses. Something completely different. They didn't look like anything familiar. Walls made of long stone blocks, really huge. Towers like truncated high cones with rounded teeth on top. In some places the battlements crumbled. 2 towers on the left were half destroyed, and next to the arch-shaped opening of the city gate, the wall collapsed almost to the ground, and stone houses could be seen in the opening. Again, unlike anything familiar. Some were higher, other lower. In some places you could see columns, balconies, and stairs above the roof cones, seemingly tiled. Square towers rose high in some places, and on both sides of the gate there were no shutters or bars in the opening. There were statues, dark, almost black, made of some kind of stone, massive, mighty bulls, tall, if you estimate 2 or even more the size of human height, menacingly bent their heads with crescent horns. They did not fancy it. It doesn't happen that the same thing is imagined by everyone at once. The longer the commander looked, the more the initial opinion was confirmed that the city was very, very old and abandoned for a long time. For some reason, the word unbelievable was spinning in his head. Incredibly old and incredibly long abandoned. This was the commander's impression, and why? He himself did not know. That's how the mysterious city looked. Not only grass grows in front of the gate, but also an adult juniper. Even a small gnarled tree has taken root on the wall. The wind must have brought this seed into the crevice. The tiled roofs gape with numerous gasps, and it is clear that nature has operated here, not human hands. There were no people here for a long time. The city gradually crumbled and decayed, although no doubt it was once built very solidly to live in it for a long time and hide from the enemies reliably. The townspeople undoubtedly had enemies. Otherwise, why would they pile up such walls of huge blocks? The wall in that place was destroyed by an earthquake, not otherwise. People simply would have not been able to take such a job, to do this, to be able to destroy the wall. No one said a word, but the commander could no longer remain silent, because he was the commander and he had to make decisions every now and then, not to show weakness, not to let anything take its course. He will have to constantly hover over the detachment like the Holy Spirit, which was now cancelled by the revolution officially. He was obliged to think and reason for everyone, and certainly in no case to betray confusion in front of his troops. He acted. He waved his whip, beckoning the interpreter and guide Dildash, and when he arrived, he asked dryly and very businesslike, "How come this is here?" The guide, reliable and proven, from poor farmhands who earned merits before the revolution and with the Red Army, well, he hesitated. He kept quiet. He didn't even try, as he usually did in other situations, to declare the mysterious dilapidated city a bad place, Yaman. Meanwhile, Dildash had a lot of Yamans known to him only. In one, they say it's impossible to stay overnight in any way, otherwise a mountain spirit with an iron face and turned back feet will come at night, strangle everyone like chickens. In another, for 50 years now, the soul of a merchant slaughtered by robbers has been wandering with the unkindest intentions towards travelers. In the third, a cursed treasure was buried a long time ago, and it's better not to stay there unnecessarily, better to drive away faster. And so on, like the Tivas in the ruins of an abandoned village, huge cat-sized blocking, blood-sucking spiders or werewolf girls. Now, however, the guide was silent, scratching his head with both hands at once. Then he shrugged. "I don't know. I've never heard of any city like that in my life. Look, it's quite old. By itself, it gradually crumbles. If someone lived here, the old people would definitely know about them. Or hunters. Old men and hunters know everything, and nobody knows anything about this. People left here a long time ago, or died a long time ago. So long ago, there was no memory left. Long ago." "Nonsense!" Comrade Arshak shouted as he rode up to them. "There shouldn't be any city here, because there has never been a single state here. And a big city is never on its own, you know? A big city means a state. I remember what I was taught. According to science, no cities are supposed to be here. There was no state here, some wild mountains." He was an Armenian, hot-tempered and feisty. Someone told the commander that Comrade Arshak had indeed been a student in St. Petersburg, in some extremely successful institution, until the revolution tore him from that place. The commander himself, frankly speaking, graduated only from high school and non-commissioned officer courses. He himself understood that big cities are a sign of the state. And he remembered with some effort that there really were no states here. However, this city was pretty damn convincing, and the commander, poking the whip in that direction, growled, "Science, yeah? Is this a mirage?" "Hardly. Comrade Arshak had to admit. It doesn't look like a mirage at all. But all the same, it's not supposed to be, per science. And what, science knows everything in the world? The commander shrugged his shoulders. At the very least, for the sake of greater reliability, you can check. He shook his shoulder, deftly dropping the carbine right into his hands, applied himself, confidently fired 3 bullets. He squinted at Comrade Arshak. He clicked his tongue with a dejected look. Like everyone else, he could see perfectly well. The bullets were knocking small pieces out of the stone bull, the one on the right from them. Commander, the guide, howled downright, "Well, why? What if this is a bad place? In such places settle those who..." "Well, that's enough," the commander said angrily. "Don't start again. And it's sickening without your yamans." And one of the red troops stretched out dreamily. "Smart people say that there are a lot of treasures in such places." The commander did not like this remark at all, categorically. He knew his people well. They were reliable guys, and he was not at all afraid that discipline would collapse overnight, and the red cavalry horsemen, ignoring their oath, would climb to look for treasures. Simply, such remarks set up the personnel to think in an abstract way. Meanwhile, the pursuit by the forces of the Special Purpose Border Guard motorized group is a serious matter and doesn't tolerate deviations from the itinerary, even in thoughts. And therefore he ordered in an unquestionable tone, "Follow me, 2-beat horse gate, march!" And he was the first to direct his horse to the exit of the gorge, clearly visible ahead. The others, of course, followed, no longer looking back at the mysterious city. Well, they never caught up with Jantai. The old devil slipped away. They were, of course, scolded, but this was not the first time this has happened in these parts, and nothing happened to them beyond the scolding. They returned by another road and did not see the city anymore. The commander still mentioned it in the report, in passing, in one sentence. Undoubtedly, Comrade Arshak did the same per his secret police requirements. This was the end of it. Scientists consumed by scientific curiosity were not found nearby, and no one would write to the Academy of Sciences specifically. They had enough of their own, more mundane and pressing concerns. Comrade Arshak, however, threatened later that when he was in Leningrad, he would certainly go to some professor and tell him about the mysterious find, but he hardly had time. Against the background of what was happening in the country, the secret police officer would not have found time to go to professors. And in the year 1936, according to rumors, Comrade Arshak was connected to the Trotsky bloc, and he vanished, as if he had fallen to the ground. This was the time of the great political purges in the Soviet Union. Staunch communists were executed by other communists. Unfortunately, so were many ordinary people who got caught up in this Stalinist game. But the commander of the Special Purpose Group, he was lucky. He survived the tumultuous years without reaching the big ranks, served no better and no worse than many, participated in the Great Patriotic War, or World War II, retired as a colonel in 1955. He told his story to his nephew during the Khrushchev period, and his nephew told the Russian author Bushkov in the early 1980s. If this mysterious city really exists, it still stands in that mountain valley. Cyclopean walls, towers, stone bulls at the gates. These bulls, by the way, serve as 100% proof that this city is not Muslim. Islam, as many people must know, forbids depicting living beings. The bull is closely connected with the ancient Iranian mythological tradition and serves as the image of the lunar deity, which was also in Central Asia 2,000 or 3,000 years ago. But see, the unknown comrade Arshak was absolutely right. Modern historical science knows nothing about ancient states in those places. Well, anyone who dares to hint that modern historical science, to put it delicately, is not comprehensive, will immediately be attacked by debunkers who cannot stand ideas that the world history is not what we know it to be, as is being told to us. Therefore, let's put an end to it. If the city exists, it still stands in that valley. But you see, no one knows where this valley is exactly. But we know where the Pamir Mountains are. So, Russian writer Andrei Linius had worked in the Soviet Central Asia in the 1980s in the Pravda Vostoka newspaper. He befriended Hoji Akbar, who worked in the Uzbekistan Writers' Union apparatus in Tashkent, Uzbekistan. One day, Hoji Akbar called Linius, asking to come to his office with a young man who had extremely interesting information. The bearer of a rather unusual information turned out to be a young, stocky Uzbek who looked like a student and who kept himself emphatically modest. He had a heavy, voluminous bag in his left hand. His name was Yunus. He arrived from a mountain kishlak or village. Yunus is a guy from the Pamir hinterland, said Hoji Akbar. He grew up in a mountain village where not only roads but also caravan trails, and in a village beyond which there is no housing or dwellings for hundreds of kilometers. And now he's a student studying to be an irrigator. I am from, and Yunus nodded and called his village. However, this name did not linger in Linius's memory. Something like Lilac, but not Lilac. You see, Lilac is a completely different, more accessible village where storks fly to rest. Yunus read Hoji Akbar's novels and came to him as he would to an older brother. What he revealed was so incredible that they would not be able to publish this in Uzbekistan. Maybe they could in Moscow, where the censorship was different, and the ploy to get this material published could work. And I'll tell you about this. But here's what Yunus told Linius and Hoji Akbar. And Yunus started with the contemporary events. He said, my notes consist of two parts. And he was, by the way, Yunus was speaking very good Russian. Modern and historical. I have observed the modern case personally quite recently, and I'm ready to answer all your questions. The historical part is connected only with the stories of my grandfather and other old men. My grandfather is 90 years old, and some old people are more than 100, but their memory is clear and none of them got confused in their memories or recollections. The difficulty is that the old people themselves don't know everything. Therefore, many questions remained unanswered. But what they remember, I wrote down to the last word. So it happened last summer in the middle of August. To be precise, on August 17 and 14:26. So August 17 at 14:26 hours. I specifically looked at my watch and immediately wrote down the time. As you can guess, I spent my summer holidays with relatives in the village, and that day I went to the mountains to visit my uncles who were herding sheep on the slopes. They asked me to take pictures of them against the background of the mountains with sheep and woolhounds. So I went to fulfill their request. I drove my older brother's motorcycle. Only on a motorcycle you can drive in some places and that over there, and even then not everywhere. I got to the pasture without incident. Here, however, several large wolfhounds rushed across to the motorcycle, but the menacing shouts of the uncles quickly subdued the dogs and forced them to return to their main occupation, to make sure that some stupid sheep did not stray from the flock. We drank tea, discussed the news, and then I took out my camera. The views there are certainly impressive. In the distance, snow-capped peaks rise, spreading in all directions, intertwining spurs, tentacles, which seem to have no end or edge. One of the spurs ended abruptly some kilometer away from us. There began a deep sinkhole, a majestic gorge with steep walls which went somewhere into the heart of the mountains. No one in the village, even the most ancient old men, knew where this gorge ends. The sky that day was blue and cloudless. The sun was shining hot in the summer, and only the deep crevices inside there was coolness inside those crevices. Suddenly the sheep bleated plaintively. All at once the experienced wolfhounds whined like puppies, lifting their muzzles up. Involuntarily we also raised our heads. A large shadow swept over us. A little to the side, a huge airplane was rapidly flying towards the gorge. It wasn't falling, it was flying, but in a very dangerous arc. There was something unusual in its flight and shape. It raced absolutely noiselessly. There were no turbines in the hanging nests located under its wings, absolutely, and there were no turbines on the tail. It didn't have any portholes at either. It seems that there were some other oddities in the design of the aircraft, but at that moment we were too excited to fix all the details. After all, the plane was rushing towards its death, right at the rocky masses, which were just a stone's throw away from here. And yet, despite this, the flight looked quite manageable. Literally, at the last moment, I remembered that I had a camera in my hands. It flashed through my mind that my pictures would later help experts investigate the causes of the strange disaster that was about to happen. I managed to click 2 or 3 times before the plane disappeared behind a rocky ridge, from which the same gorge, which is called Urukli Su in the village, stretched deep into the mountains. Of course, this gorge will seem majestic to a casual traveler, but it's too narrow for the wingspan of a large airliner and too tortuous for its flight. My heart sank in anticipation of a terrible and inevitable explosion. But a second passed, another, a third, a minute passed. The silence was complete. Even the dogs and sheep calmed down. My uncles and I stood in a daze for a while. Then I got on the motorcycle and, desperately revving along a serpentine track, rushed to the gorge, familiar from childhood. That's it. The gloomy brown sheer walls, a loud mountain stream foamed around the stones, the old uruchin trees creaked softly, the disturbed arrow snake darted to the side, and no traces of the disaster. There is still not a cloud in the sky. The strange aircraft disappeared, although it had absolutely nowhere to go. In utter bewilderment, I returned to the pasture. After some time, my uncles and I began to think that there was no plane, that we mistook a piece of fog for an airplane. Such wisps of fog of the most bizarre shape often hung somewhere over the lowland. However, they never moved. That evening I developed the film. Mountains, sheep, uncles, wolfhounds, everything turned out great. But no airplane was printed on the photo paper. There were only some white spots on the light background, resembling an elongated drop. I was upset and confused. And that's when my grandfather told me about what happened in the gorge in the old days. But before we get to Yunus's narrative, Yunus and the 2 writers, they discussed recent UFO sightings in Uzbekistan. A lot of our guys have seen UFOs, Yunus said, but no one has seen a UFO shaped like an airplane. I'll bet your grandfather saw a similar plane in his youth, Lamius suggested, and for sure heard about it from his grandfather. No, Yunus smiled disarmingly. He saw a cave from which the strange clouds were flying out. They quickly rose to the sky and dissolved into it, like smoke from a barbecue. But he didn't see the airplane, and he couldn't see it. During his youth, airplanes had not yet flown over the Pamir Mountains. Far in the depths of the gorge, there is an impassable obstacle. My grandfather told me that once there was an entrance to a huge cave behind this obstruction. As a young man, my grandfather saw it with his own eyes and even looked into it from a close distance. There were bad rumors around about this cave. It was said that if you enter it, you would either disappear or you will get sick with a strange disease, and in a few months you will die in agony. The grandfather also believed in it, because I saw that behind the entrance to the cave lay a mountain of white dried bones of various animals. There were also human skeletons. It was believed that these were the victims of abominable snowmen. Is that so? Did they know about the Bigfoot in the village? Lanius was surprised. I am just translating this to modern concepts, Yunus clarified. Of course, in the village of those times it was called differently. According to those who saw it, it was a strong and tall creature, 2 heads taller than a normal person and covered with thick fur, such as a yak. It moved on its hind legs and resembled a human being in its habits. But the encounter with it always ended badly. Therefore, ordinary mountaineers were very wary of approaching the cave. Only healers went there, because rare herbs grew there in abundance, which were difficult to find in other places. Last year, an old healer was still alive, who in his younger years went to the cave with his father and older brother. At the request of my grandfather, this healer, already white-haired and suffering from an incurable disease, invited me to his place and told me a lot of interesting things about this cave. Everything he said is written down here. Yunus patted the notebook with his palm. What kind of a cave was it? No one knows exactly. However, it turns out, on one hand, a snowman has set up his lair there, and on the other hand, UFO pilots have chosen the cave for their needs. How can this be combined? I don't know. Yunus stubbornly shook his head. So what's the main thing? Yunus looked into the Russian's eyes and said, there is an ancient belief in the village that this cave stretches underground through the entire ridge and comes out on the other side of it. In some places there are holes in the cave, so huge that their ceilings and walls are lost in darkness, despite the pale light spilled in the air. Other underground paths allegedly diverge from these holes. Yunus lowered his voice. The healer told me that similar passages exist under other ridges and peaks. They permeate the entire mountain strata, and some exits lead even to the plains, far into the steppes and sands, into the heart of the dunes. No one knows exactly what is going on in this underground labyrinth. The healer claimed that time itself flows in a special way down there. According to legend, these passages were used in the old days by the armies of Iskander the Two-Horned One and by the warriors of other ancient conquerors. For example, Mithridates, Eupator, who was also called the Great One in Asia. Hordes of conquerors appeared suddenly where they were not expected and disappeared with rich loot and suddenly as they came. It is certain that these were not always Eastern warriors, meaning people from the East. There were many fair-haired and blue-eyed among them, but Genghis Khan Temuchin also knew the secret path. He was the last great lord whose troops penetrated the mountains unhindered. Linnaeus looked at Hoji Akbar, who kept a straight face. Listen, my friend, Linnaeus turned to Yunus. Turn to Hoji Akbar. I don't know about the ghost plane and the snowman, but if Yunus's information about the underground tunnels is not a figment of the imagination, if they are at least one iota true, then he should have been brought not to the newspaper offices, but to the Academy of Sciences. Take your time. Hoji Akbar made a sign. Listen to the end. Scientific expeditions have been in our region more than once. Yunus spoke again. The first expedition came during the reign of the White Tsar. There were many officers among its participants. The old medicine man, the father of the medicine man or healer, from whom I learned this story, led them to the cave, warned that it was dangerous to enter there. After that, with the permission of the head of the expedition, he returned to the village. The Russians stayed in the gorge until the end of the summer. It is unknown whether they entered the cave or explored only the gorge itself in its further course. But when they returned to the valley through the village, several people were missing among them. One, badly wounded, they carried on a stretcher. The head of the expedition told the healer that the poor man had fallen from a high ledge. But when the healer offered his help, the colonel replied that they had their own healer. From the village they went to the valley already on horseback. As to what became of the wounded man, the healer did not know. Subsequently, the healer went to the cave more than once for herbs. He never found a single fresh grave in the gorge, although I was quite sure that after returning from the gorge, the expedition was reduced by several people. There were no other expeditions to our village under the White Tsar. The healer heard that learned Russian people came to other villages on the other side of the ridge, but we did not have Russians here for many years. The next expedition appeared in the village only in 1932. Yunus continued. Among its participants, people in leather jackets kept to themselves. The healer believes that they were the Chekists. That is, he thinks so now. And in those days, of course, no one had any idea about the Chekists, the secret police operatives, in the village. They asked about the cave, then took a guide, the same father of the last healer, who died at the beginning of the last winter. From their conversations, the healer realized that they knew something about the cave and about the first expedition. And they had a map of the gorge, which they looked into all the time. They were definitely interested in something specific. They had some devices with them, in leather cases on their backs. When the expedition reached the cave, the senior of the Chekists ordered the guide to return to the village and even sent an armed guard with him, so the guide would not accidentally turn back. The expedition returned from the gorge a month later. They were very angry. There was also a few people missing among them. But here's what's amazing. Fresh graves have not appeared in the gorge. The following year, as soon as the snow came down, the third expedition, the most numerous of all, arrived in the village. Very soon our people figured out that the bulk of it consisted of prisoners. After taking a break following the passage along a difficult road for several days in the village, the whole group went to the gorge, leaving the lookouts, who made sure that none of our people left the village. They threatened to court-martial the violators. This expedition stayed in the gorge until the onset of the first cold weather. Then they returned, but it was difficult to say whether they all returned or not, since the group was very numerous. They set up their camp on a hill behind the village and did not allow any of our people to visit it. After a short rest, they went to the valley. But before that, their chief gathered the entire population of the village in front of the village council and announced that a virus of a dangerous disease has been detected in the gorge. So the entire gorge is recognized as a dangerous zone, which is strictly forbidden to go to. But the old healer was forced, of course, to violate this prohibition, because otherwise he would not have found the right herbs and would not have been able to treat people. And what did he see near the cave? He saw the entrance to the cave was laid with stones so tightly that it was impossible to disassemble this burden even by forces of the entire village. Finally, the last expedition arrived in the village in the summer of 1958. They called themselves scientists, said they were looking for traces of Bigfoot, and asked old people about it. The old people doubted whether to tell them about the cave or not, because no one had lifted the ban on entering the area. While the old men were talking of this, a strong fire broke out in the expedition camp. No one was killed, only a few people received minor burns, but the worst thing is that the equipment and all the papers of the expeditions were burned in the fire. It was whispered in the village that this fire was not an accident. It was as if someone was driving the expedition away from the gorge. Therefore, the old people in the end decided not to tell anything about the Bigfoot. The expedition left the village without learning anything. More learned people did not come to our places. Hoji Akbar looked at Linus. What if they just forgot about this cave? He suddenly suggested. After all, so many events have passed. There were purges, political repression, a big war. The people responsible for this action are no longer there. The materials of the expedition could have been lost somewhere. Why not remind about them? Pause. No, it's better to use literally basis of this idea first. What do you think? If all this is true, the Russian said, then I'm ready to admit that this is the most amazing story I've ever heard. But it is also true that when transferred to a literally basis, it will lose a lot. It's too much mixed up. UFOs, Bigfoot, extra long caves with magical properties. Or is this not the whole story? He turned to Yunus. The student looked upset. Perhaps he was hoping for a more enthusiastic reaction. Everything, he sighed. Well, almost. What does this almost mean? Some time ago, the cave was opened again. Our people have not been going there for a long time. Even the healer. On my last visit, I decided to take a look at it, at least from a distance. And now it turned out that it was really open. There is no stone obstruction laid out once by the hands of the convicts. There is no trace of it. Maybe an earthquake? Hoji Akbar suggested, as if continuing an old argument. Yunus praised Allah and said, there have been no strong earthquakes in this area for a long time, for many years. Moreover, the earthquake could not clear the obstruction in any way. It would rather add stones to it. Yunus, can we take a trip to this wonderful cave? Linus asked the guy. I'd like to see this miracle with my own eyes. The road there is dangerous, Yunus said. In some places, it is necessary to make your way over the precipice on a sheer wall. If you don't have the skills to go to the mountains, then you can't go there. There's nothing to try. I see. Who cleared the gap? Bigfoot or a ghost plane? I don't know. Yunus opened his big bag that still looked like a pregnant rabbit and fished out a light pink cylinder with a rough but definitely treated surface. Such things are scattered all over the gorge in front of the cave. Previously, according to the old people, there was nothing like that out there. And with these words, he placed the cylinder on the table. The Russian reached for the find. The cylinder was very heavy. It looked like a marble, light pink marble with streaks from white to black hues. Its side surface was rough but geometrically correct, as if subjected to some rough the same type of, it was processed with something, but the foundations were uneven, as if chipped by the chisel of a crazy stonemason. One of the chips was made obliquely, but the second, flatter, allowed the cylinder to be installed in an upright position. Don't ask me what it is. Yunus shook his head. I don't know. There was a pause. Well, the Russian said, thank you, Yunus, for the story. It was interesting to listen to, but I would also like to get acquainted with the contents of your notebook. I brought it for you, the student exclaimed. There are a lot of things that I didn't have time to tell you about. Read everything and then we will meet and discuss. And let this stone remain with you. Okay, let it remain, the Russian agreed. As for our possible cooperation, unfortunately the newspaper is in a jam right now, so I can't start reading your notes immediately. I will try to do it soon. Here's my telephone number. Call me in a week or rather in 2 weeks. Maybe a constructive idea will come to me. Then we will talk. All right, Yunus said, getting up. It's a wonderful thing, Hoji Akbar summed up. They said goodbye and left. Lanius, the Russian journalist, mechanically leafed through the notebook. Yunus wrote very tightly, and every line almost without making omissions. Lanius ran to one of the pages with his eyes. Yunus was describing his village, but if his oral speech was distinguished by juiciness and imaginary, then on paper these qualities were lost. However, it could not be ruled out that the guy deliberately adhered to a right style, trying to preserve only the facts. No, it didn't make sense to read it superficially. It required complete concentration, detachment from any distraction. But Lanius could not afford it now, so he postponed this reading till tomorrow, or at least until Monday. And then the phone rang. Lanius was called to the deputy editor. So the Russian put the notebook in the wall cabinet and moved the cylinder to his desk. He was just missing a massive paperweight for the current mail that he was getting, so it came in handy. Twice more before the end of the week he opened the notebook, but each time something prevented him from concentrating. The following week there was an urgent task, then the All-Union Scientific Conference began. To be honest, for 2 weeks the Russian did not look at the notebook, although he was going to. Yunus called delicately, inquired if Lanius had read his notes. The Russian asked for another 2 weeks delay. In short, when he called a month later, he was still not ready. Yunus replied that there was no need to hurry now, since he was leaving for the village before the autumn. He also added that perhaps he would get new evidence. He did not call again, neither to Lanius nor to Hoji Akbar. So they remember Yunus less and less. The sharpness of the impression made by his story dissolved into the routine of everyday life as completely as the mysterious object disappeared in the sky of the Chilanzar market. But that UFO sighting is for another video about Central Asia. However, Yunus's notebook kept coming across Lanius, but the Russian did not have time to read it at all, and yet he was determined to study the student's notebook, at least on principle. After all, he gave him his word. In the end, Lanius took the notebook home in the hope that one day he would be able to carve out a free evening. He also took home the marble cylinder. The cylinder was supposed to remind him at the right moment about the notebook and about his duties in relation to it. So, Lanius thought if Yunus had called at least once more, it would have prompted him immediately to take up the notebook. But he never called. Meanwhile, very important events were brewing in the Soviet Union, and the country eventually disintegrated. Look, Central Asia contains many mysteries. Its sands, its mountains, for thousands of years hide secrets of ancient and vanished civilizations, cryptozoology and much more. I've read accounts of the underground cities, and I shared some with you, of the Gobi Desert, of the Chinese provinces not far from Central Asia, and much more. There is something to it. I'll try to bring you more stories because we deserve to know. If you like my research, please support me in the description. You will find how to do it in the description to this video. Please subscribe to my channel and tell others. Thank you.